Video C6: Trade and Markets. We've looked at trade between buyers and sellers, firms and their customers, but we haven't yet considered trade between different regions. This trade between regions happens when producers have a comparative advantage based on their opportunity cost in one region versus the other. With a comparative advantage, it ends up making sense for there to be specialization based on the comparative advantage, followed by trade to provide a mix of goods and services at the end of the day. Note, the comparative advantage is based on the idea of opportunity cost. That is, the relative costs of production in terms of other goods which could be produced. Sources of comparative advantage between firms include economies of scale and the related idea of agglomeration externalities. Agglomeration happens when there are significant concentrations of supply chains and knowledge in the production of particular goods or services. Silicon Valley in California would be an example of this. A completely different phenomenon would be physical differences between places, such as climates and soils. The result of all of this is that trade occurs between nations which are both very different from each other, but also those that are very similar to each other. We can consider international trade by using our usual tools of supply and demand and thinking, first of all, about a domestic market with supply and demand. On top of the domestic market, the good is available at a world price. One way of thinking about this perspective is that the world is a large place relative to the domestic market. So let's go through the mechanics of that. We'll start with our usual supply and demand, and we'll add the world price now. The supply and demand is a domestic supply and domestic demand, and some of the purchases in this market up to the world price are produced internally by domestic producers. Where the world price intersects the demand curve then determines how much is purchased in total domestically, and so the difference between the amount produced domestically and the amount consumed domestically, that is between Q domestic and Q total, is imports from the rest of the world. So trade in the domestic market, when the world price is lower than the domestic equilibrium price, results in imports. After a tariff squeezes out world competition. When open to international trade, the world price thus becomes the price that rules in the domestic market. Domestic producers end up only receiving the world price and thus produce less than they would in equilibrium with a market closed to international trade, which would occur at the intersection of the domestic supply and domestic demand. Consumers in this market end up doing very well at the world price because it's a lower price than they would otherwise receive, and indeed end up purchasing more in total than they would with a closed economy and just domestic supply and domestic demand. One of the consequences here is that domestic producers, in addition to receiving a lower price, end up not producing as much as they otherwise would, and some producers may be squeezed out of the market. Some consumers end up purchasing at this lower price, people who would not even be purchasing at all at the higher domestic-only price. One consequences of this is that frequently a tariff can be imposed in order to protect domestic producers. While this is anti-competition, it provides benefits to the particular domestic producers that may be very concentrated and very valuable to them, while at the same time the costs may be very diffuse amongst many, many purchasers. We can look at what happens after the tariff has been imposed when we assume that it brings the price all the way up so it totally squeezes out world competition. Well, this is what it would look like. We start with our domestic supply and domestic demand again and the world price, and now we can add in a tariff that brings the world price domestically with the tariff all the way up to what would be the equilibrium price if there were no trade at all. The result is, in fact, that there is no international trade. Domestic production equals domestic consumption and is the total amount that is produced and sold within the country. We can compare the two prices now, the price with the tariff and the price without the tariff. So the result is that consumers in the domestic country end up paying the full price of the tariff.